Good morning and welcome to the Massillon Museum. The Massillon Museum is an art and history museum in downtown Massillon in Stark County, Ohio. The Massillon Museum is about 50,000 square feet and is accredited by the the American Alliance of Museums. Massillon Museum has a very large eclectic collection of over 150,000 artifacts covering many different areas, including photographs, furniture, textiles, circus paraphernalia, ceramics, pottery, china, militaria, and American Indian artifacts. My name is Chris Kraft, and I'm on the staff of the Massillon Museum. And this morning, I have the honor of giving you a tour of a small portion of the Massillon Museum's collection of American Indian artifacts. The museum's American Indian collection includes textiles, points and stone tools, pottery, baskets, and miscellaneous other artifacts of the different cultures of American Indians. The museum's collection covers 6 different geographic areas of North America, about 20 different cultures. And we're going to start this morning by looking at our collection of points and lithic tools, stone tools. We have in the collection approximately 7,000 tools and points. Obviously, we're not going to bring all those out and show them to you, but we do have a selection that I wanted to show you this morning. We're going to start with this piece right here. This is a flint knife. Very large flint knife. One of the interesting things about the museum's collection of stone tools and points is that most of them were collected here in Stark County prior to the advent of deep plowing, the agricultural method of getting very deep and what happens with deep plowing is that points get broken. So most of these points and these tools were collected in the late to mid 19th century, right at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. So a large flint knife blade like this is very, very rare, and to find one that large is very significant. A lot of people will look at that and say, oh, it's a spear point. Not at all. There is no way that you could put that on a spear and be able to wield that spear effectively. The stone would be way too heavy for that. At the same time, people would look at these points and would say, oh, these are arrowheads. But in fact, no, they're not. These are spear points. This particular spear point, we believe, is Paleolithic. In other words, it's older than 10,000 years ago. And right here we have a drill. They would have used stone drills to drill holes in wood and also in leather and in hides to create clothing and to be able to sew those together. This is an axe head. We have many, many, many axe heads. And I want to come to this end of the case, and these 2 stones are very interesting. This is called a banner stone. Now, we're not sure of all the purposes of a banner stone, but we think it was used as a weight on an addle-addle. An addle-addle was a wooden tool used to throw a spear, so that you had more trajectory and more throwing force. They would put the banner stone toward the handle end of the addle-addle, adding weight to the addle-addle, so when it was thrown, it added even more force so that the spear would penetrate further into the animal. And this, very hard to see because it's on a black background, but this is called a celt. It's a hand axe. And if you look very, very closely at that hand axe, how smooth it is, how perfectly it's made, this begins to show you how much time and care that these cultures put into creating these tools and these points. And they were very important to them, very important. So that, to me, the amount of time that went into smoothing that and scraping that, chipping the stone first to get the general shape, and then scraping and sanding it with another stone until it became this fine piece that you could hold in your hand and use as an axe with your hand. So that's called a celt. In 2017, the museum was very, very honored to be gifted a collection of over 2,000 points from Mr. Phil Cosentino. Phil Cosentino was a World War II veteran and also worked for the East Ohio Gas Company. But his real passion was amateur archaeology. And Phil Cosentino used to walk the fields all over northern Stark County around Jackson Township looking for points, and he found several thousand of them. In one place, he found an immense concentration of scrapers and points, and it was around Noble's Pond in Jackson Township, which is only about 3 or 4 miles north of the Massillon Museum. In 1985, Mr. Cosentino discovered that they were going to sell the Noble's Pond area and turn it into a housing development. Well, in fear of losing that concentration of points, he contacted Dr. Mark Seaman of the archaeology department at Kent State University. Dr. Seaman put together a team and went to Noble's Pond and created an archaeological dig. They discovered that the concentration of points at Noble's Pond was so intense, it's one of the largest concentrations of stone points in the state of Ohio. And interestingly, they believe that the reason for that is that ancient Paleolithic peoples used to drive large herds of animals into a concentrated area right near where Noble's Pond is now, so that they could kill many of them at one time. And in the process of doing this dig, they discovered, if you look at number 14 here, that's a scraper. They discovered a high concentration of scrapers around the Noble Pond dig. That led them to hypothesize that these hunter-gathering cultures, when they killed those large numbers of herd animals at that site, they would stay there for a long period of time and process the hides, because the scrapers were used to scrape the hides so that they could use them for their structures, for their houses, and also for their clothes. I would also point out number 3, this is a Clovis point. This point was dug up at Noble's Pond and is about 13,000 years old. It is one of the oldest points in the United States. At one point, archaeologists believe that the Clovis culture was the oldest known culture in North America, dating back to 13 or 14,000 years ago. Over the last several years, there have been other digs throughout North America that are now pushing back that date and making archaeologists reassess what they think were the earliest cultures. There's one that was dug in New Mexico in 2021, where they discovered on an ancient lake bed a series of footprints, children's footprints, and by carbon dating the wood that was found at the same level from old trees and that sort of thing, they've discovered that those footprints date to 21,000 years ago. So now they know that humans were in North America as early as 21,000 years ago. But this is one of the oldest points to be dug up at the Noble's Pond dig. There are a whole variety of others here that would tend to make the archaeologists believe that the Noble's Pond site was used by cultures from 13,000 years ago all the way up to contact, which is contact with Europeans 500 years ago. So that site was used by many cultures over many thousands of years, and it's a very important site for ancient American Indians here in Ohio. The Massillon Museum is very proud to have in its collection several Navajo weavings. There are 2 on exhibit in this gallery now, here and here. Both of these date to the late 19th, early 20th century. These were called eye dazzlers, and they were created in wool by the Navajo weavers, and by that period of time they were using commercial dyes that they could get from the white man. These rugs, and we call them rugs, but in fact they could have been used for rugs, they could have been used for saddle blankets on horses, they could have been used for doorways, for their living structures, whatever they needed them for. The Navajo, or the Diné, as they called themselves, were originally from Western Canada. And about 600 years ago, the tribe moved to the Four Corners region of southwestern United States. They were a hunter-gathering tribe, but when they moved to the Four Corners region, they came into contact with the Puebloans and also with the Spanish culture that came along in the 1500s. And through that contact, they began to adopt agriculture and sheep herding as a way of making a living and expanding their culture. Over time, the Navajo women learned to weave the wool from the sheep. And by the late 19th century, Navajo weavings became very, very popular and very, very valuable. We have over here one of our prized possessions at the Massillon Museum. This is a Navajo chief's blanket, or a man's wearing blanket. This particular blanket is a phase 2 Navajo chief's blanket. There were 3 phases. The first phase, which are the most rare and the most valuable, were much more simple than this and did not have the blocks in the weaving, but were rather simply brown and white striped. They are the most rare and the most valuable and date back to the beginning of the 19th century. This is a phase 2, and we believe it dates to about 1850, somewhere between 1850 and 1870. It's made from wool, from sheep that the Navajo raised, and it is dyed with natural dyes from that part of the country, including the red dye, which was made from a bug called the cochineal bug, and when dried and crunched up and mixed with water, created a red dye, which they used on this rug. The third phase Navajo rugs were made after the Navajo people were put on the reservation, and they were starting to use commercial dyes. So the third phase rug is not nearly as valuable or as rare as the phase 1 and the phase 2 rugs. But this is a Navajo chief's blanket, man's wearing blanket. It is a phase 2 from about 1850. Massillon Museum owns a large collection of ceramic pottery, American Indian ceramic pottery. American Indians valued pottery and worked very hard to create pottery to meet their needs for storage. And wherever there was a source of malleable clay, that's where they would make pottery. The American Indian did not have the potter's wheel. All of their pottery was made by the coil method, where they wrapped the coils around, stacking a coil of clay up, and then scraping it together to create the pot. So you don't see the coils in the pottery, but that's how it was made. They fired them in pit firing method, where they dug a hole in the ground. They would put all their pottery, their dry pottery, down in that hole and build wooden structures all around the pottery. And they would have to burn that structure and keep it going for 12 to 24 hours, sometimes 2 or 3 days, in order to get the heat high enough to fire the pottery. Generally, the American Indians never used glazes. They were unknown to the American Indians. They created their own paints using clay slip, which is simply watered down clay. Think of mushroom soup, and then dyed with different minerals that they would find in their environment. All the pottery you're seeing here are Puebloan pottery and date from the late 19th to the early 20th century. And the different pueblos made different pottery with different symbols. And of course, you'll see they're highly decorated, and everything that you see on these pots for decoration are symbolic. And it's interesting because it's abstract design. It's an abstract pattern evoking symbology of the beliefs of the Puebloan people. I'm not versed in what the various symbols mean. I do know, for instance, at the top of this pot back here, which is a San Ildefonso pot, at the top, you'll see around the top ring, that stepped pattern. I know that represents clouds. Most of the symbology used by the American Indians, of course, represented their natural environment because that was the most important thing to their livelihood. It's how they made their living, it's how they existed, it's how they ate, it's how they slept, it's how they dressed, was through the natural world. So all the symbology is about the natural world and its importance to the American Indian culture. We have here pottery from 4 different cultures, or 4 different pueblos. There's San Ildefonso, we have Pima, we have Zuni, and we have Santa Clara. If you see the black pot on top, that's a Santa Clara pot, and it's very typical to that particular pueblo. And even today, artists today still use these techniques to create pottery that are reminiscent of their ancestors. Notice that it has 2 spouts. The reason for that is this is a marriage pot. So this would have been created to celebrate the marriage of 2 families, or a man and a woman from 2 different families. Very, very interesting. But pottery was very important to them. Symbology was very important to them. Abstract design. And we're talking abstract design that's 150 years old. But I think the most interesting thing for people to realize about this pottery is that it is handmade, that the designs on it symbolize the natural world, which was so important to their culture. And the beauty of the work is unsurpassed even today. Very, very important to American Indian culture, and very important to the Massillon Museum as well. I want to finish up this morning's mini tour of the Massillon Museum's collection of American Indian artifacts by looking at these miscellaneous artifacts in this case. I mentioned to you at the beginning that the collection represents 6 different geographical areas. We've already talked about the Puebloan pottery, which would have been southwestern United States. Most of the stone tools and points that I showed you were from this area, the Midwest or Eastern United States. Right here, I want to show you these moccasins. These are Cheyenne, and the Cheyenne were from the Oklahoma area, Kansas, Oklahoma area. So that's southern Midwest. Notice the beadwork on these. Very, very important to them. And again, symbology in the patterns that are used in the beadwork on those moccasins. Secondly, I want to draw your attention to this carved bowl. This is supposed to represent a seal, and it's from the Tlingit tribe along the Oregon, Washington, Western Canadian border along the coast. These people lived right along the seacoast, the Pacific coast. And you'll note, if you look very closely, you'll see mother of pearl has been inserted in the eyes and then as decorative elements along the edge of the bowl. This wooden bowl would have been used to serve nuts and fruits to guests. If you were to come visit, I would have brought out my very decorative bowl and filled it with nuts and fruits for your entertainment. If we move along, you're going to notice this is a hair ribbon that goes more than halfway along the case. And this was supposed to have belonged to Red Cloud. Now, Red Cloud was one of the Sioux chiefs involved in the Battle of Little Bighorn. But that's what our records show. Now, did it really belong to somebody famous? Well, that's what the records show, but it may have been just a rumor. Who's to say? At any rate, we believe with research that the patterns and everything in the beadwork represent the Winnebago tribe, which would have been in Minnesota. Now, it may be that Red Cloud owned this at one time and acquired it through trade. Who's to say? But at any rate, It is a Winnebago hair ribbon, supposedly owned by Red Cloud. And then right above that, you're going to see a cribbage board. And this cribbage board is carved and created out of the tusk of a walrus. And this comes from the Inuit of northern Alaska. Beautiful work, absolutely magnificent work. And finally, next to that is a totem. Now, this is a miniature totem. Totems were quite large. They were very common to most of the cultures along the Washington, Oregon, Alaska, Canadian coast. This was created by the Tlingit in the early 20th century and was made for the purpose of the tourist trade. But it's still a fine artifact. It's a fine piece of artwork, and the Massillon Museum is proud to have that in our collection. I would like to finish up by mentioning spirituality. We've shown you a lot of artifacts this morning, and they all legally belong to the Massillon Museum. They're part of our collection. But American Indian beliefs were very deep into spirituality. They believed everything had a spirit. The Great Spirit itself, the spirit of the stars in the skies, the spirit of the earth, the spirit of the water, the running water. Everything had a spirit. You cannot, in their belief, own a spirit. You cannot contain a spirit. Their spiritual beliefs extended also into objects, inanimate objects like the ones I've been showing you. So they believed that each one of these objects had a spirit. Who is it for us to question that? The Massillon Museum has adopted a philosophy that though we legally own these artifacts, in fact, they still belong to the spirit of the object, and the spirit cannot be owned. We are the trustees. We are the caretakers of these objects. We don't really own their spirit. Thank you.